plant evidence. If they came again, I wanted to see them before they saw me. The sun had barely set when the first vehicle appeared at the far edge of the gravel road, headlights bouncing off the tree trunks as it climbed toward my property. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor or someone lost, but then the second vehicle appeared, and then a third, and by the time I stepped out onto the porch with a flashlight, I counted 6 in total, forming a slow, deliberate convoy. It wasn't the slick black SUVs from before. This time they had brought a mixed fleet, 2 HOA-marked trucks, a couple of unmarked sedans, and most notably, 2 county sheriff's cruisers with their lights on but sirens off. They rolled up in a semicircle around the front yard like they were staging for a tactical operation, and I immediately understood the president's new play. She had somehow convinced local law enforcement to join in under the pretense of public safety seizure, which meant she thought she had finally found a way to get her hands on my cabin legally. The president herself stepped out of the lead truck, flanked by 2 of her private security contractors, and greeted the deputies like they were old friends. One of the deputies, a man I didn't recognize, stayed near his cruiser, eyes scanning the property with a seriousness that told me he had been fed a story and was trying to decide how much of it was true. The other deputy, however, was someone I had met before at a county fundraiser, and when our eyes met, there was the faintest flicker of recognition. I came down the porch steps slowly, making sure my hands were visible, and asked what the emergency was. The president took a step forward and declared that the HOA had determined my property to be a direct hazard to the surrounding community due to multiple code violations and potential environmental risks, and that the board had voted unanimously to seize the property until remediation could be completed. I asked her to point to the statute or ordinance that gave her that power, knowing full well she couldn't. She gestured toward the deputies instead, saying they were here to assist in the lawful execution of the seizure. The first deputy cleared his throat and said they had been informed that there were immediate safety concerns requiring removal of all residents until further notice. His tone was firm but not aggressive. He was repeating what he had been told, not what he believed. I told him calmly that I had all the necessary documentation proving my compliance with state and county regulations, and that any attempt to remove me without a court order would be a violation of my rights. That was when the second deputy, the one I recognized, stepped forward. He asked if I had the documents on hand, and I said yes, they were inside. While the deputies followed me to the porch, the president stayed back, talking in low tones to her security men, clearly expecting the seizure to proceed. But when I returned with a thick folder and laid out my permits, inspection approvals, and legal property maps on the hood of a cruiser, the dynamic began to shift. The deputy I knew flipped through each page carefully, nodding as he read. He looked at the other deputy and said, "Everything here checks out. None of this falls under HOA jurisdiction." The first deputy frowned, clearly caught between his briefing and the evidence in front of him. He stepped aside to radio someone, probably his superior, while the president's expression tightened. She came over, interrupting the deputies, insisting that there was more to this than a few papers, and that she had evidence of illegal modifications stored with the HOA records. I told her she could bring that evidence to a judge, and if it held up, I'd comply. Until then, she was trespassing. The tension was thick enough to taste, and for a moment, I thought she might actually try to push past the deputies to assert herself. But then the radio crackled, and the first deputy confirmed he had spoken to his supervisor, who told him this was a civil matter outside of their enforcement. He turned to the president and said, "Ma'am, we can't assist with this. You'll have to pursue it through the courts." Her face went pale, then flushed with anger, and she tried to protest, but both deputies were already stepping back toward their cruisers. Her security detail looked unsure whether to follow her lead or the deputy's example. I could have ended it there, but I decided to drive the point home. I told the deputies, within earshot of everyone present, that I would be filing a formal harassment complaint with the county against the HOA, and that I would include the presence of their marked vehicles in the documentation. The deputies didn't object. They just nodded, which told me they were fine with her being reminded that this stunt had crossed a line. The president muttered something about not being done, then motioned for her team to pull out. The convoy broke apart slowly, headlights sweeping across the cabin walls as they reversed down the road, until the sound of engines faded into the distance. As I stood there in the sudden quiet, the deputy I knew lingered for a moment. He lowered his voice and told me he'd heard chatter that the HOA was planning something bigger, something meant to draw media attention. He didn't know details, but he said it involved staging an event that would make my property look like a danger to the community. I thanked him for the warning and promised to be ready. The moment he drove off, I walked the perimeter of the property with a flashlight, checking every gate, lock, and camera. Then I went inside, sat at my desk, and began making calls. If they wanted to stage a spectacle, I'd be ready to flip it on them in front of the same audience they hoped to sway. By midnight, I had arranged for a friend in the county to keep me updated on any sudden permit filings or media inquiries related to my address. I had also called my contact in the local news station, not to give him the full story, but to let him know there might be an interesting public confrontation coming soon. If the president wanted a stage, I was going to make sure the lights were bright enough to show every flaw in her performance. I also reached out to a private investigator I had worked with before, instructing him to dig deeper into the HOA leadership's recent activities. He promised to have a preliminary report in a few days. Over the next 2 days, I caught glimpses of unfamiliar vehicles idling just beyond the tree line, always gone before I could get close enough to see the plates. It was clear they were watching, waiting for their moment. On the third day, I spotted 2 people with cameras on tripods setting up at the far end of the gravel road, far enough away to claim they were on public land. I didn't approach. I simply made sure they saw me watching them, then went about my work as if nothing were out of the ordinary. I wanted them to think I was unfazed, that they could catch me off guard. The morning of the so-called compliance inspection started with a deep stillness over the ridge, the kind that makes every sound carry further than it should, and I could hear engines long before they reached my driveway. When they came into view, it was a convoy, 3 HOA vehicles, a white van with some kind of portable inspection equipment strapped to the roof, and 2 cars I recognized as belonging to local reporters. They hadn't come quietly, they'd come to make a show of it. The HOA president stepped out first, dressed in a sharp suit instead of her usual weekend blazer, and carried a thick folder under her arm like it contained the key to my downfall. Behind her, the inspection team emerged, clipboards, cameras, measuring tools, all moving with the swagger of people convinced they were about to catch me in some unforgivable violation. The reporters hung back, cameras already rolling, clearly tipped off to expect something worth broadcasting. I stayed on the porch, leaning against the railing with my coffee in hand, giving them the picture of a man completely unbothered. The president announced loudly enough for the news microphones to pick up that they were here under authority granted by the HOA bylaws to conduct a mandatory property inspection for public safety. Her voice was all confidence, but I could see the gleam in her eyes. It wasn't just about finding something, it was about humiliating me in front of the county. I let her speech run its course, then walked slowly down the steps, stopping halfway across the yard. I told her she could inspect whatever she wanted, but that she was on record being warned that my property was outside her jurisdiction, and anything she did today could and would be used as evidence of harassment. That earned a smirk from one of the men with a clipboard, but the president didn't flinch. She waved for her team to begin, and they fanned out across the yard like they were sweeping a crime scene. They measured the height of my porch railing, examined the woodpile, photographed the solar panels, and even peered into the rainwater collection barrels as though they might find something sinister floating inside. All the while, the reporters circled, filming every angle, narrating quietly into their microphones. I knew exactly what the president was hoping for. She wanted to create the impression of chaos, of a property riddled with unsafe or illegal modifications, whether or not her findings held up in court. What she didn't know was that I'd spent the last week preparing my own inspection of her. I had hired a private investigator to dig into the HOA president's own property holdings, and what he found was enough to make her current display look like a tragic comedy. Multiple unpermitted additions to her lakefront home, violations of local zoning ordinances for an oversized dock, and a landscaping project that had encroached on protected wetland. I had all of it in crisp, printed reports, complete with time-stamped photos, notarized witness statements, and county records. So I waited until her team had circled back toward the front of the cabin, clearly disappointed that they hadn't found anything damning, and then I stepped forward with a manila envelope in my hand. The president looked at it like I was handing her a live snake. I told her, loud enough for every microphone to catch, that I understood how important compliance was to her, and that I had taken the liberty of documenting a few areas where she herself might need to make corrections, purely in the interest of community safety, of course. I opened the envelope and held up the first photo, a wide shot of her illegal dock extension, followed by a close-up of the permit records showing none had ever been filed. The crowd shifted. Even the reporters leaned in. I moved on to the next image, her unapproved guest house, and then the one after that, showing her landscaping project spilling into protected land. Each time, I kept my voice calm, factual, almost helpful, like I was doing her a favor. The president's face went from flushed with confidence to pale with realization. She stammered something about ongoing paperwork and misunderstandings, but the damage was done. The reporters weren't filming my porch anymore, they were filming her. The moment hung in the air like the aftermath of a firecracker, and then one of the reporters broke it by asking her if she intended to correct these violations immediately. She tried to deflect, but another question came, and then another, and suddenly she was backing toward her car with a frozen smile. Her inspection team stood awkwardly, unsure whether to keep working or follow her lead. I decided to give them a way out. I told the reporters that I was happy to answer any questions about my own property, but that it seemed unfair to subject them to a circus when the real compliance issues clearly lay elsewhere. The chuckle from the crowd was small, but it was enough to seal the moment. The president ordered her team to pack up, muttering about rescheduling for another time, and within minutes the convoy was pulling away, the reporters trailing after like sharks scenting blood in the water. When the dust settled, I walked back up the porch steps, sat down, and let the quiet settle back over the yard. I knew this wasn't over. People like her didn't retreat without planning a counterstrike, but I also knew the balance had shifted. The public spectacle she had hoped to create had flipped on her, and now she was the one on the defensive. Later that afternoon, I got a call from one of the reporters who had been there. He told me that their station was running a segment that evening about the HOA president's questionable compliance record, complete with the photos I'd handed over. He wanted to thank me for being willing to go on record, and I told him I was just protecting my property. But in truth, I was doing more than that. I was making sure every future move she made came under scrutiny, and nothing makes a person in power more cautious than the knowledge that the spotlight is on them. That night, as the segment aired and the phone calls started, neighbors, acquaintances, even strangers thanking me for standing up to her, I sat in the cabin and thought about how much the game had changed. Before, she had been able to operate with the confidence that most people wouldn't dare to challenge her in public. Now, every decision she made would be filtered through the possibility of it becoming tomorrow's headline. And for someone like her, that was worse than losing. It was exposure. The kind that made allies drift away, donors rethink their support, and subordinates hesitate before following orders. I didn't need to win every battle from here on out. I just needed to make sure she kept tripping over the mess she'd made for herself. The mountains outside were calm again, the moon hanging low over the ridge, and I let myself smile at the thought that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to understand that I was not the easy target she had thought I was. The president's humiliation from the inspection fiasco didn't fade quietly. Instead, it seemed to harden into something more dangerous. For the next week, I could feel the tension in the air, the way you can feel the heaviness before a thunderstorm. The usual passive-aggressive letters from the HOA stopped entirely, which told me she was working on something bigger behind the scenes. Then, late on a Thursday afternoon, it arrived. A courier in a navy blazer, holding an envelope like it contained the fate of nations. He handed it over without a word and left before I could even ask a question. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, embossed with the HOA seal, declaring that due to grave and ongoing safety concerns and imminent threat to community order, the HOA had voted to pursue legal action in partnership with unnamed state-level allies to force the immediate seizure and auction of my property. The language was sharp and theatrical, clearly designed for intimidation, and I could practically see her sitting at her desk, smiling as she signed it. It was her final card, the one she believed would end this game. But the moment I read it, I knew it was actually the end of hers. I didn't waste time with outrage. Instead, I picked up my phone and made 2 calls, one to my attorney and the other to an old contact from my days working federal cases, someone who still owed me a favor. Within an hour, both were on board with a plan that would not just stop her cold, but leave her with nowhere to run. The next morning, I drove into town, but not to the courthouse or my attorney's office. I went straight to the county administrative building, where my contact was waiting with a sealed file. Inside were records I had requested weeks earlier, back when this fight was still mostly about fines and inspections. They documented a paper trail of the HOA president's activities, misuse of HOA funds for personal expenses, backdoor contracts awarded to relatives, and a suspicious property transfer that looked a lot like fraud. Every document was legally obtained, verified, and ready to be made public. I spent the next 2 hours organizing the material into a single, coherent packet, complete with a timeline and references to applicable laws. By the time I was done, it wasn't just a case of harassment anymore. It was a case of criminal misconduct that could take her down completely. I didn't tell her any of this. I wanted her to walk into the next meeting thinking she was about to deliver the final blow, only to realize she'd just stepped onto the gallows herself. The opportunity came faster than I expected. That afternoon, an announcement went out that the HOA was holding an extraordinary session, open to all residents to discuss urgent enforcement matters. It was a transparent setup. She wanted the room full so she could make an example of me. I arrived early, not to sit quietly in the back this time, but to take a seat in the second row, where she would have to look at me every time she glanced up from her notes. The hall filled quickly, the murmur of voices rising as people guessed at what was about to happen. The president entered last, wearing that same confident smile she always wore before a public confrontation, and for a moment I almost admired her ability to perform under pressure. She called the meeting to order and wasted no time, launching straight into her speech about protecting the integrity of the community and removing elements that threaten our shared safety. Every sentence was delivered with the precision of someone who had rehearsed in front of a mirror. Finally, she got to her climax, announcing that the board had voted to initiate legal proceedings to seize my property and auction it for the greater good. She looked at me as she said it, her smile widening as though she could already see me packing my bags. I let the silence hang for just a moment after she finished, then stood and asked if I could respond. She hesitated, probably wondering if denying me would make her look weak, then nodded. I took the microphone, set my folder on the table, and began not with anger but with gratitude. I thanked her for the opportunity to speak, for the transparency of an open meeting, and for the reminder of how important it was to protect the community from those who would abuse their authority. Then I opened the folder. I started with the misuse of HOA funds, showing copies of bank statements that matched with personal purchases and travel expenses that had nothing to do with HOA business. I moved on to the no-bid contracts awarded to a company owned by her cousin, complete with invoices and payment record. I could feel the room leaning in, the murmurs growing louder, and I didn't rush. I laid out the fraudulent property transfer last, explaining how it violated both state and federal statutes, and how I had already submitted the evidence to the relevant authorities. By the time I finished, the president's smile was gone, replaced by a frozen, pale expression. She tried to interject, but I spoke over her, not shouting, just steady and controlled, reminding the room that the real threat to the community was not a cabin outside their jurisdiction, but a leader who used her position for personal gain. The reaction was immediate. One board member stood up and announced they were rescinding their support for her actions. Another suggested an independent audit of all HOA finances. The crowd erupted into arguments, some demanding her resignation, others just staring at her in shock. She tried to regain control, banging the gavel and insisting the meeting was still in order, but the momentum had shifted beyond her reach. I stepped back from the microphone, gathered my papers, and returned to my seat without looking at her. The rest of the meeting devolved into chaos, and by the time it ended, the president left through a side door without speaking to anyone. 2 days later, I heard from my attorney that she had officially resigned, citing health reasons, though everyone knew it was to avoid the investigation that was now in motion. The board announced an interim president and quietly dropped all proceedings against me. The HOA's hired security disappeared from the neighborhood entirely. As for me, I went back to my life on the mountain, the air once again filled only with the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional call of a bird. But there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that I hadn't just defended my property, I had exposed the rot at the core of the organization that thought it could bully me into submission. On the first quiet morning after her resignation, I sat on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the sun climb over the ridge. The forest was bathed in gold, the mist curling away from the treetops, and for the first time in months, I felt the tension drain from my shoulders. Somewhere down in town, she was probably packing up her office, shredding papers, and wondering how it had all slipped away so quickly. The truth was, it hadn't slipped, it had been pulled out from under her, piece by piece, by someone she underestimated from the start. I raised my mug in a silent toast to the peace she had tried so hard to shatter, and to the knowledge that no matter how many people like her came along in the future, I'd be ready. Because once you've stood your ground against a storm like that and watched it break apart, you stop fearing the next one, you start waiting for it.